The smell of smoke reached her before the sound did. Cora noticed it the way she noticed most things in Ashvale Keep, quietly, without drawing attention to herself, while everyone else was too busy watching the powerful to bother watching her. She was carrying a tray of warm milk and honeyed bread down the eastern corridor when the scent curled under her nose like a warning she almost ignored. Almost. She had been a maid in the King's Keep for 3 years, long enough to know which floorboards groaned, which candles burned faster than they should, which guards fell asleep during the midnight watch. Long enough to know that the eastern wing, where the young pup slept, was never left unattended after dark. That was the rule. The only rule Sebastian Donfang enforced with his eyes, rather than his voice. And that was enough. Nobody broke rules that the Alpha King enforced with his eyes. She paused at the corridor's bend, the tray balanced in both hands, and looked toward the child's door. It was slightly open. The candle inside cast a flicker she didn't like. Too wide, too orange, too restless. She set the tray down on the stone floor without a sound. The door swung open under her palm, and the heat hit her face like a fist. The curtain beside the window had caught. The heavy linen panel, old and dry as autumn leaves, was already half consumed, and the fire was crawling sideways along the wooden beam above it, with the patient confidence of something that knew it would win. The room smelled of burning resin and hot stone. On the bed, curled beneath a wool blanket with one small fist pressed under his cheek, was Eli, 4 years old, dark-haired like his father, completely unaware that the world around him was beginning to burn. Cora didn't think. She crossed the room in 4 steps, ripped the blanket from the bed, wrapped it around Eli's body, and pulled him against her chest in one motion. He startled awake with a gasp, his small hands grabbing at her linen collar, eyes wide and disoriented. "Hold on," she said, low and even, the way she spoke to spooked horses. "Hold on to me." She turned toward the door just as the burning curtain rod gave way and collapsed. The flaming fabric swung outward and down in a wide arc, and there was no room to step around it, no angle that didn't pass through the edge of that fire. She turned her back on it instinctively, curling forward over Eli, tucking his face into her neck. The fire caught her left shoulder. The pain was a white, obliterating thing. It wiped out thought, sound, the weight of the child in her arms. Everything except the knowledge that she had to keep moving. She ran. 3 steps to the door, through it, into the cooler air of the corridor, and she dropped to her knees on the stone floor and rolled her burning shoulder against the ground, smothering it, gasping through her teeth, because she would not scream while the child was still awake. Eli was crying softly into her neck. She held him tighter with her good arm. The shouts came seconds later. Guards, then more guards, then the deep commanding bark of someone whose voice alone silenced a corridor. She didn't look up immediately. She was focused on her breathing, on making it slow and controlled, on not letting the trembling in her hands become something Eli could feel. The stone beneath her knees was cold. She pressed into that cold deliberately. The pain in her shoulder was enormous and present, and she filed it somewhere she couldn't afford to open right now. Boots stopped in front of her, not the leather-soled shuffle of a guard. These were heavier, quieter, more deliberate, the kind of step that didn't need to announce itself. She looked up. Sebastian Donfang was not a man who needed armor to look dangerous. He stood in the corridor in a dark tunic, half-laced at the throat, his long braids loose from whatever had bound them during the day, his pale blue eyes moving from his son's face to her shoulder, to her face with the precise, unhurried assessment of someone who had learned long ago that panic wasted time. His expression did not change. That was the most unnerving part. He crouched down, slowly, completely, until he was level with her, and reached out to take Eli from her arms. The child went to him immediately, burrowing against his chest with a small, shuddering exhale. Sebastian's large hand covered the back of his son's head. He held him for a moment in a silence that felt like something private, something Cora should not have witnessed. Then those pale eyes came back to her. "Your shoulder," he said. It wasn't a question. "It's manageable," she said. The look he gave her suggested he disagreed, but he didn't argue. He stood, lifting Eli with him, and turned to the nearest guard. "Get Marin. East corridor now." His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. The guard was already moving. Cora tried to stand and found that her legs had made a different decision. The stone came up to meet her, and she caught herself on her good hand, jaw locked, refusing to make a sound. She was aware, distantly, that the pain had moved past the stage of sharp and was now a deep, radiating thing that lived in her bones. The wool of her dress had burned into the skin in places. She knew what that meant. She had seen burn wounds before on the blacksmith's apprentice in the lower keep. She knew what the next few days would look like. What she had not anticipated was the hand that came under her arm. Not rough, not impatient. Simply present, and lifted her to her feet with a steadiness that felt almost architectural, like being raised by something that would not drop her because dropping things was beneath its nature. She looked up. Sebastian had passed Eli to a guard and was now beside her, one hand at her elbow, his eyes on her face with that same still, measuring quality. "I don't need," she started. "You're going to the healer's room," he said. "Not a request." She closed her mouth. He didn't touch her beyond that one steadying hand. He walked beside her through the corridor, and she was aware with every step of how strange this was. The Alpha King of Ashvale, Lord of 7 Packs, walking beside a maid with a burned shoulder, as though it were the most natural arrangement in the world. The guards they passed did not know where to look. She couldn't blame them. She didn't know where to look either. Marin, the keep's healer, was a compact woman with silver-streaked hair and hands that smelled permanently of calendula and beeswax. She had Cora on a bench with her dress cut away from the shoulder, before Cora had fully registered sitting down. The wound was ugly. Marin's sharp intake of breath confirmed it. A burn that crossed from the upper arm to the blade of the shoulder, red and raw, and already beginning to blister at the edges. "She needs to rest for at least a week," Marin said, not to Cora but to the figure still standing in the doorway. "She'll have it," Sebastian said. Cora turned her head to look at him, which hurt. "I have duties in the morning." "Not anymore," he said. There was no cruelty in it. There was nothing in it except certainty. The same certainty that lived in everything he said. Not arrogance, not dismissal, just the flat, settled weight of a decision already made by someone who was not accustomed to being unmade. He looked at her for a moment longer, something moving behind those pale eyes that she couldn't name, and then he was gone, and the corridor outside was quiet. Marin applied a cold compress of bruised aloe and linen soaked in something that smelled of pine resin and mint. The relief was immediate, and Cora let herself breathe. Her good hand rested in her lap. Her heart was still moving too fast. She thought about Eli's weight in her arms, the way he had grabbed at her collar, the way he had cried without making much noise, just small controlled sobs, as though he too had already learned that the keep was not a place for loud grief. She thought about the curtain catching, about how fast it had moved, and then, quietly, unavoidably, she thought about the candle. She had lit every candle in that room herself at dusk. She knew exactly how she had positioned them, well away from the curtain, centered on the iron holders, as she had done every night for 3 years. The candle that had set the curtain burning had not been in its holder. It had been on the window ledge. She had not put it there. She stared at the wall of the healer's room and let that knowledge settle into her like cold water into stone. Slow, thorough, filling every crack. Someone had moved that candle. Someone had set that room to burn. And the only person who slept in that room was the Alpha King's 4-year-old son. The pain was still there when the gray light of dawn began pushing through the wooden shutters, dull and deep, the kind that settled into bone and stayed. Cora had not slept. Maren had changed the dressing twice through the night, her hands efficient and gentle, her mouth mercifully quiet. The paste she applied smelled of burnt lavender and cedar resin, and the relief it brought was real but temporary, the way relief always was when the thing causing pain was still present and unresolved. Cora lay on the narrow healer's cot and stared at the ceiling beams and let her mind do the one thing it was apparently determined to do, regardless of her preference. She thought about the candle. She had lit every candle in Eli's room herself at dusk. She did it every evening. It was part of her rotation, one of the quiet tasks that nobody assigned formally, but that she had absorbed into her rhythm, because the boys' room was on her corridor, and she passed it twice each evening, and it cost her nothing to check. She knew exactly where she placed them, centered on the iron holders, away from the curtains, away from anything that could catch. The candle that had set the room on fire had been on the window ledge. She had not put it there. She sat up before Maren returned, moving slowly, protecting the left shoulder. The healer had left a clean linen tunic folded on the bench, cream-colored, loose enough to avoid pressing the bandage. Cora dressed with one hand, working the ties with a patience born from having no alternative, then looked at herself in the small polished metal mirror near the window. 23 years old, and she looked like she had slept inside a fire, which was technically accurate. There was still soot at the roots of her blonde hair, and her face carried the specific pallor of someone managing continuous pain. Not the white of fear, but the washed-out tone of a person quietly working through something that refused to leave. She braided her hair with one hand. The result was uneven. She did not care. She was still sitting with that reality. The candle, the positioned flame, the deliberate hand behind it, when the memory she had been carefully avoiding finally surfaced. 3 days ago. The narrow service corridor behind the map room, that thin stone passage the nobles forgot existed, or chose to ignore, because it smelled of tallow and old dust and held nothing of interest to anyone with power. She had been moving through it with an armful of folded linen when the voices started on the other side of the wall. 2 men. She had recognized one immediately, Lord Cedric Vane, the king's chief counselor, a 60-year-old man with parchment hands and eyes that never settled honestly on anything. The other voice she had not recognized, low, careful, carrying the slightly drawn vowels of someone from the Northern Territories. "The boy is the only obstacle," the unfamiliar voice had said. "The boy is protected," Cedric had answered. Then, after a pause that lasted exactly long enough to feel deliberate, "For now." She had walked away from that wall with her heart hammering and told herself she had misunderstood. That counselors discussed succession constantly. That obstacle could mean a dozen different things inside the political architecture of a shifter court. She was a maid. Interpreting the private conversations of noblemen was exactly the kind of thing that made women in her position disappear quietly and permanently. So she had chosen not to know. And now Eli had nearly burned alive in his sleep. The weight of that choice pressed into her chest with a thoroughness that the burn on her shoulder could not compete with. She breathed through it, slow and deliberate, the way she breathed through everything that threatened to undo her composure, by treating it as a physical problem with a physical solution. Breathe in, breathe out. Name what you know. Decide what to do with it. What she knew. The candle had been moved. The corridor guards had been absent. Someone with access to that wing had created the conditions for that fire deliberately. And 3 days before it happened, 2 men behind a wall had spoken about the king's son as though he were a problem to be solved. She was turning that over in her mind when the infirmary door opened and Bertram Hale stepped through it. The name formed in her thoughts with the specific quality of something unwelcome before breakfast. Bertram was the keep's head steward, 38 years old, broad-shouldered, with dark hair divided with surgical precision and a mouth that could produce exactly the right quantity of smile for any occasion. He had been attentive to her since her first year in the keep. Small considerations left at her workstation, an extra rest rotation in the winter, a well-placed word with the housekeeper when Cora had dropped a silver tray and deserved a formal reprimand. For nearly 2 years she had believed this meant he cared. Then Nell, the laundress with a loose tongue and a genuinely good heart, who slept in the room beside hers, had explained with cheerful matter-of-factness that Bertram kept the same arrangements with at least 3 other maids, and that the reason was not affection. It was leverage. People who owed Bertram small favors did what Bertram needed without asking questions. Cora had quietly reconfigured how she moved around him after that. Perfect courtesy, careful distance, nothing that could be read as debt. Cora. He looked at her shoulder, at the bulk of the bandage beneath the tunic, with an expression that was very well assembled. Genuine concern had a different texture. This one was too smooth, too ready, as though it had been prepared before he walked through the door. I heard what happened. You should be resting. I'm fine, she said. The king ordered a full week of recovery. I know. Then why are you dressed at this hour? She watched him for a moment. There was something different in him this morning. A tension across the shoulders, a flatness behind the eyes that his careful expression was working to cover. The question had not come from concern. It had come from the need to know what she had seen, what she had heard, how much she had already filed away in the quiet, attentive mind he had spent 2 years trying to assess and recruit and ultimately underestimate. I couldn't sleep, she said. He glanced at her hands, empty. No water jug, no linen, no practical reason to be standing dressed at this hour. She watched him notice the absence and choose not to address it, and that deliberate silence told her more than any response would have. Rest, he said. The keep needs you well. She nodded and held her composure until his footsteps had faded fully down the stone corridor. Then she sat back on the edge of the cot and let herself feel the cold that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. Bertram controlled every maid's access to every corridor in the keep. He managed guard rotations through the domestic steward's office. He could remove a man from a post for an hour without raising a single question. His office sat directly behind the map room, adjacent to the service corridor where she had pressed herself against the wall 3 nights ago, and heard Lord Cedric Vane discuss the king's son as an obstacle with a remaining expiration. She placed her good hand flat on her knee to stop it from trembling. This conspiracy was not distant. It did not live in some rival territory or hostile pack across the mountains. It breathed the same air as the boy it wanted dead. It walked corridors she walked. It ate in the great hall. It knocked on doors and asked gentle questions and waited to understand exactly how much damage control was necessary. And now they knew she had been in that room when it mattered. Or perhaps, and this thought arrived with the specific chill of something she could not dismiss, they had known for longer. Perhaps Bertram's network of small favors and carefully managed debts had another function entirely, mapping which people in the keep were noticing the wrong things, paying attention at the wrong moments, standing in service corridors with armfuls of linen at precisely the wrong hour. She had been on that map for 3 days and had not known it. The knock at the infirmary door came in 3 measured beats, the rhythm of someone accustomed to doors opening before the echo of the knock had finished. She crossed the room and opened it. Sebastian Donfang stood in the corridor with a guard posted 2 steps behind him, but his pale eyes were fixed entirely on her face, with that quality of attention she had registered the night before. Complete, unhurried, the kind of focus that did not perform itself. He was already dressed for the day. Leather vest, the crossed straps of his chest harness, the dark fur mantle across his shoulders, long braids loose in a way that suggested he had risen early and moved quickly. There was a faint scar at the corner of his jaw she had not noticed by torchlight. The morning corridor made him look, if anything, more settled than the night had, like something that belonged to daylight and stone and the hard architecture of real decisions. He looked at her shoulder, then at her face. Then something shifted behind his eyes, not softening exactly, more like recognition. "You didn't sleep," he said. Not an accusation. A simple, accurate observation, and its precision unsettled her in a way she had not prepared for. "No," she admitted. "There is something you want to tell me." Also not a question. She studied him across the threshold, this man who governed 7 packs, who had walked beside her through a burning-smelling corridor as though rank were a concept for other occasions, who was now standing in a healer's doorway at early morning, looking at her with the patient certainty of someone who already understood that she was carrying something he needed. Every careful instinct she had built across 3 years in this keep said to measure, to weigh, to wait until she was certain she knew where she was standing before she stepped. But Eli had cried in the dark with fire moving toward him, and there was another night coming after this one. And the people who had set that fire were walking the corridors right now with well-assembled faces and keys to every door. "Yes," she said. "There is." She told him everything. Not immediately. Not in the doorway with the guard standing 2 steps behind him, and the corridor open on both sides. Sebastian had understood that without her saying it. He had simply stepped back, looked once at the guard, and the man had moved to the far end of the corridor, with the quiet efficiency of someone who had learned that the king's silences carried the same authority as his orders. Then Sebastian had entered the infirmary, closed the door, and stood near the window with his arms at his sides and said nothing. Just waited. The morning light crossed his shoulders, and the room smelled of cedar resin and the remnants of Marin's herbs, and Cora stood near the cot and organized what she knew into the clearest sequence she could manage. She told him about the candle, the exact position she had set it in each evening, and the position it had been in when she opened the door. She told him about the absent guards, the corridor that should have held 2 men and had held none. She told him about the service passage behind the map room, about the armful of linen, about the 2 voices through the wall, and the specific words she had heard, and the pause that had followed them. The boy is the only obstacle, for now. She told him about Bertram's visit that morning, about the question that was not a question, and the silence that had answered more than any response would have. Throughout all of it, Sebastian did not move. He stood near the window with his pale eyes on her face, and the stillness of someone who was processing every word at a level below expression. She could not read him. That was unsettling in its own way. She had developed, across 3 years of observing powerful men in this keep, a reasonable ability to track the small signals of what they were thinking. Cedric Vane touched his rings when he was calculating. The captain of the guard blinked too fast when he was hiding something. Bertram's smiles arrived a half-second too late when the situation surprised him. Sebastian gave her nothing. Not coldness, not dismissal, simply a quality of contained attention that felt more complete than anything she had encountered in a person before, as though he were the kind of man who had decided long ago that reactions were a resource to be spent carefully. When she finished, the room was quiet for a moment. "How long have you worked in this keep?" he said. Still not a question. A request for information, delivered in the same flat, precise register as everything else he said. 3 years, she said, and in those 3 years, who have you reported to? Bertram, through the housekeeper, Mrs. Aldrin. Mrs. Aldrin. Something moved briefly across his face, a single compression of the jaw, quickly controlled. When you heard the conversation in the service corridor, why didn't you come forward? It was the question she had been bracing for, and she answered it honestly, because she did not think evasion would serve her here, and because she was tired, and the burn on her shoulder was making her less patient with the instinct to protect herself through omission. "Because I am a maid," she said, "and Lord Cedric Vane is your chief counselor. And the chain between a maid's report and your ears passes through at least 4 people, 2 of whom report to Cedric. I calculated that by the time the information arrived anywhere useful, I would have already been reassigned to a posting outside the keep, or found a reason to have an accident on a staircase." The silence after that was different from the ones before it. Heavier. "You thought my own council would bury it," he said. "I thought it was more likely than not," she said. "I still think that." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he moved. Finally, after all that stillness, crossing to the small table near the door where Marin kept a pitcher of water and 2 cups. He poured one and held it out toward her without ceremony. She took it because her mouth was dry and because refusing felt like the kind of pride that cost more than it was worth. "Cedric Vane has served this keep for 22 years, Sebastian said. He was not defending the man. His voice had the quality of someone laying out the dimensions of a problem. "He was my father's counselor before he was mine. He has access to every formal record in this keep, every territorial agreement, every succession document." "I know," she said. "If what you heard is accurate, he has been planning this for long enough to build infrastructure. Bertram's network of favors, the guard rotations, the access." He paused. He would not move against Eli unless he had already secured what comes after. She had not thought that far, and the realization arrived with a cold clarity. Removing the king's son was not an end. It was a step. Toward what exactly she did not know. But a man like Cedric Vane did not build the architecture of a conspiracy for the satisfaction of a single act. He built it toward a destination. "What does he want?" she said. It came out less like a question and more like thinking aloud. "Territory," Sebastian said. "The eastern reaches. My father promised them to Cedric's Pack generation as a condition of his loyalty. When my father died, I reviewed the promise and found it was made under duress. Fabricated documentation, witnesses who no longer existed. I revoked it." His jaw shifted slightly. "Cedric has been patient. I gave him credit for accepting it. I was wrong." The shape of it assembled itself in Cora's mind with the horrible neatness of things that were obvious in retrospect. Cedric could not move against Sebastian directly. The king was too powerful, too guarded, too central. But a kingdom without an heir was a different equation. A grief-stricken father. A court destabilized by loss. An old counselor with 22 years of institutional knowledge, perfectly positioned to guide the chaos. And a maid with a burned shoulder who had been in the wrong corridor at the wrong time and had apparently survived long enough to become a loose thread that needed managing. "He'll move quickly now," she said. "The fire didn't work. He knows the boy is being watched more carefully. And Bertram knows I was asking questions this morning." "You weren't asking questions," Sebastian said. "Bertram doesn't know that." Another brief silence. Then something that was almost, not quite, but almost, the beginning of a different expression crossed the king's face. Not warmth exactly. More like the recognition of a quality he had not expected to find. "You need to be moved," he said. "Moved. Out of the servants' quarters, out of Bertram's reporting structure, somewhere in the keep where your access is controlled by someone I trust, rather than someone Cedric has spent years positioning." He looked at her steadily. "There are 2 rooms in the East Tower that fall under the direct household of the king's personal guard. They are used for protected witnesses and advisors under temporary security arrangements. You would be given one of them." She stared at him. "I'm a maid. You are currently the only person in this keep who can corroborate a conspiracy against my son," he said. "That reclassifies your situation considerably." She wanted to argue with the logic of it and found she couldn't, which was irritating. She looked down at the cup in her hand, at the water she had barely touched, and tried to locate the part of this that felt wrong. There was something. Some resistance that was not about the facts of the situation, but about what it meant to accept protection from a man she did not know, in a keep that had already demonstrated its ability to house dangerous intentions beneath courteous surfaces. "Why would you trust what I've told you?" she said. "I could be lying. I could be working for someone who wants Cedric removed." You could be, he said. He did not sound troubled by the possibility. You're not. You don't know that. I know that you ran into a burning room for my son, he said. I know that you held him while your shoulder was on fire and did not make a sound that would have frightened him further. I know that you told me about Bertram this morning, despite the fact that doing so placed you directly in the path of whatever he does next. He paused. I also know that a person working a deliberate deception doesn't include the detail about choosing not to come forward 3 days ago. That detail made you look complicit. A liar removes it. She had no answer for that. The burn on her shoulder chose that moment to remind her comprehensively of its existence, a wave of deep radiating heat that she absorbed through deliberate stillness. Jaw set, eyes fixed on the middle distance. She felt, rather than saw, Sebastian's attention sharpen slightly, that precise quality of his focus shifting to note the thing she was suppressing. He didn't comment on it. He moved to the door, opened it, and spoke to the guard at the corridor's end in a low voice that she could not fully hear. Then he turned back. Maren will move you to the East Tower this afternoon, he said. Stay inside until then. Don't go to the servants' hall. Don't send word to anyone. Don't let Bertram find a reason to speak with you again. And after, she said. He looked at her across the infirmary, this quiet, burned, sleepless woman in a borrowed tunic with an uneven braid and a cup of water she still hadn't drunk. And something in his expression settled into a register she could not name. Not pity, not calculation. Something that sat between recognition and decision. After, he said, we find out exactly how far Cedric's reach goes, and we dismantle it. He paused at the door. All of it. Then he was gone, and the corridor outside was quiet, and the morning light sat still and pale across the stone floor, and Cora stood in the middle of the healer's room and realized that somewhere in the last hour, without quite choosing to, she had stepped off the narrow path she had walked carefully for 3 years and into something much larger and far more dangerous. She drank the water. It was cold and tasted of iron from the pitcher, and it was, in that moment, the finest thing she had ever had. The East Tower room smelled of beeswax and old pine. It was small but deliberate. A narrow bed with a wool blanket the color of storm clouds, a writing desk with an iron candle holder, a single window that looked out over the inner courtyard where the King's Guard ran their morning drills. Cora stood in the center of it after Maren left and turned slowly, taking inventory the way she took inventory of everything. Methodically, without sentiment, cataloging what was present and what was absent, and what each detail suggested about the intentions of whoever had prepared the space. The bed had clean linen. The candle was fresh. There was a small ceramic bowl of dried herbs on the windowsill, rosemary and something she didn't recognize, dark and faintly medicinal, and a pitcher of water on the desk beside a folded cloth. Someone had laid out a second tunic across the foot of the bed, gray wool, better quality than anything she owned. A pair of soft boots sat beneath it. Someone had known her size. She sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the boots for a long moment. Then she looked out the window at the courtyard below, where 2 guards were running a blade drill in the cold morning air, their breath misting in short controlled bursts. She watched them without really seeing them, her mind still moving through the architecture of what Sebastian had told her. The Eastern Reaches. A fabricated promise. 22 years of patience curdling slowly into something that had finally decided a 4-year-old child was an acceptable casualty. She thought about the corridor conversation again. The boy is the only obstacle. She had been carrying those words for 3 days like a stone in her pocket, trying to convince herself they were lighter than they were. Now she set them down and looked at them plainly. Eli had a nursemaid named Dora, a round-faced woman in her 50s, who adored the boy with the uncomplicated ferocity of someone who had no children of her own. Dora had not been in the room last night. She was not in the room most evenings, because her duties ended at supper, and Eli's nighttime routine fell to the rotation of corridor maids. Cora's rotation. Was that coincidence or construction? She was still pulling at that thread when the door opened without a knock. She was on her feet before she had consciously decided to stand, which said something about the state of her nerves that she found mildly embarrassing. But it was not Bertram, and it was not Cedric Vane, and it was not anyone with quiet, dangerous eyes and manufactured concern. It was a boy. Eli stood in the doorway in a dark wool tunic and small leather boots, his black hair uncombed, one hand braced on the doorframe as though he had arrived at a run, and stopped himself just in time to remember manners. He looked at her with his father's eyes, pale, direct, carrying a quality of attention that seemed too settled for his age, and said nothing for a moment. Then, "You got burned." "A little," she said. He considered this with the gravity of someone weighing testimony. "Does it hurt?" "Less than yesterday." He looked at her shoulder, then at her face, then at the room behind her with the brief, comprehensive survey of a child who had grown up inside a keep and understood instinctively that rooms told you things if you looked at them correctly. His expression shifted slightly. Not quite satisfaction, but something adjacent to it. "Papa had them put the good boots out," he said. "I noticed," she said. "He said you were brave." Eli delivered this with the directness of someone reporting a fact, rather than offering a compliment. He doesn't say that about many people. She did not know what to do with that, so she gestured to the desk chair. "Do you want to sit down?" He came in and sat in the chair with his feet dangling and looked at her with that unsettling, steady gaze. There was a guard outside the door. She had registered the shadow of boots in the corridor. But Eli had apparently been permitted to come, which meant Sebastian had allowed it, which meant this was not an accident. She was being assessed. She understood that. She did not mind. "Are you going to stay in the keep?" Eli asked. "For now," she said carefully. "Dora cried this morning." He said it without particular distress, simply as information. "She said it was her fault because it was supposed to be her night." "It wasn't her fault," Cora said. "I know." He picked up the edge of the desk cloth and put it down again. "Papa told her that too. He said it exactly the same way you just said it." He looked up at her. Like it's true, but also like there's something else that's true that nobody's saying yet. She looked at this 4-year-old child with his father's eyes and his father's quality of stillness, and felt something move in her chest that was not quite grief and not quite tenderness, but lived in the territory between them. "You're very observant," she said. "Papa says that's good," Eli said. "He says most people wait to be told what to notice. He says the ones who notice first are the ones who last." She filed that away, the particular weight of it, the fact that Sebastian Dawnfang was raising his son with that specific philosophy, and was still turning it over when the shadow of the guard outside the door shifted, and the footsteps in the corridor changed, heavier, more deliberate. Eli slid off the chair without being asked, smoothed the front of his tunic, and moved to stand near the window in the posture of a child who had learned that when his father entered a room, it was polite to be clearly visible and clearly unoccupied. The gesture was so practiced and so small and so quietly heartbreaking that Cora had to look at the wall for a moment. Sebastian came through the door and looked first at his son, a single, comprehensive look that appeared to satisfy some internal accounting, and then at Cora. "He insisted," Sebastian said, about Eli, in the tone of a man who was explaining something that had not actually required much resistance. "I gathered," she said. Something almost moved at the corner of his mouth. Almost. He crossed to the desk, set down a folded document, and remained standing. He was wearing different clothes than this morning. A formal dark tunic with the pack seal at the collar, the kind worn for council appearances. Which meant he had either come from the council room or was going to it. And either way, the timing of this visit was deliberate. "Cedric called a council session this morning," he said. "Emergency grounds. He is proposing a formal investigation into the fire. Specifically, into the question of negligence in the guard rotation. She understood immediately. He's going to name the guards who were absent. He's going to name them and then explain why they were absent, Sebastian said. His version will involve a forged reassignment order that traces back to someone in the domestic staff. The cold arrived again, settling precisely. He's building a trail. He has been building it since before the fire, probably since the moment he decided the fire was the method. Sebastian's voice was even and uninflected, but there was something beneath the evenness, a contained quality, like pressure behind a closed door. The trail will point to a maid. It will look credible. It will have documentation. It will point to me, she said. He did not deny it. She sat with that for 3 full seconds, feeling the shape of it. Cedric had not merely planned to kill Eli. He had planned to survive the failure of killing Eli. The fire was not the only construction. The false paper trail was the insurance, ready to be deployed if something went wrong, a maid to blame, a domestic scandal to consume the court's attention while the real architecture stayed hidden. She had been selected as the scapegoat before she had even walked into that burning room. He didn't know I would be the one to go in, she said slowly. Any maid on that corridor rotation could have walked in first. He built the trail against whoever was on duty. Yes, Sebastian said. That means the documentation is generic enough to be adapted. He can write my name into it now that he knows it was me. She looked up. How long do I have before he presents it formally? The council reconvenes tomorrow morning. One night, she pressed her good hand flat against the desk surface and thought. The document Sebastian had set down. She glanced at it. A folded page sealed with a small dark mark that was not the pack seal. She looked at him. What is that? She said. A record of your employment history in this keep, he said. 3 years, unbroken. No disciplinary actions, no formal complaints. Mrs. Aldrin signed it before I informed her of the nature of the inquiry. She doesn't know what it will be used for. A pause. She also mentioned, without being asked, that you have never once been late to a rotation, and that she considers your character unimpeachable. I thought you should know that. Something pressured the back of her eyes briefly. She did not let it become anything. That's a character reference, she said. It won't counter fabricated documentation. No, he agreed, which is why we are not countering it. He looked at her steadily. We are going to let Cedric present his trail, and when he does, we are going to show the council something that makes the trail impossible. Not disputed. Impossible. What do you have? She said. Not enough yet, he said, but you heard a second voice in that corridor. A voice you didn't recognize. Northern accent. He watched her. I need you to remember everything about it. Pitch, rhythm, any word choice that felt particular. Because I have a suspicion about who that voice belongs to. And if I am right, then Cedric has made a mistake he cannot recover from. She closed her eyes and went back to the service corridor. The cold stone, the linen in her arms, the voices seeping through the wall like smoke through a crack. She listened to the memory the way she had learned to listen to things that mattered, not for the obvious content, but for the texture beneath it. The way the unfamiliar voice had shaped the word obstacle. The particular way it had landed on the T, clipped and precise. The slight elevation in pitch on only, as though the word carried private emphasis. She had heard that elevation before, not in that voice, in a similar one. Her eyes opened. Lord Aldrich Morn, she said. The Northern Territory delegate. He has a younger brother. I've refilled his wine at 2 formal dinners. The pitch is different, but the rhythm is the same. It's a family pattern, the way certain households shape certain words. Sebastian looked at her for a long moment. Aldrich Morn's younger brother, he said quietly, is currently positioned as a minor trade envoy in the Eastern Keep. which places him within access of the Eastern Reach's border records. He paused. And which means Cedric has been coordinating with a foreign delegate's family member inside my own territorial structure. The weight of that landed between them like something physical. That's treason, she said. Yes, Sebastian said. It is. The council chamber smelled of burnt tallow and old ambition. Cora had never been inside it. Maids did not attend council sessions. They refilled the carafes before the doors closed and disappeared back into the corridors like water receding from stone. But she stood inside it now, in the gray wool tunic and the boots that fit precisely, her burned shoulder dressed in fresh linen beneath the fabric, her uneven braid the only thing about her that was not completely controlled. Sebastian had not asked if she was ready. He had come to the East Tower at first light, looked at her once and said, "Stay close and say nothing until I call on you." Then he had walked to the council chamber, and she had followed, and the guards at the door had opened it without question, because the king had passed through first, and that was apparently sufficient. The chamber was a long room with stone walls hung with territorial maps and a single oak table that ran almost its full length. 7 men sat around it. She recognized most of them by face, if not by name. The gray-haired territorial lords who had attended the formal dinners where she had poured wine and been invisible. Lord Cedric Vane sat at the far end of the table, to the left of the king's chair, in the position he had occupied for 22 years. He was dressed with the careful formality of someone who had prepared for this moment. Dark wool, the counselor's chain at his collar, his parchment hands folded with composed patience on the table in front of him. His eyes found her the moment she entered. Something moved through them. Fast, controlled. Gone before anyone less attentive would have caught it. Not surprise. He had expected her to be present. What he had not expected, she thought, was the quality of her stillness. She met his gaze without flinching, and looked away, first only because she chose to, not because he had forced it. Sebastian took his chair at the head of the table. He did not look at Cedric. He looked at the room the way he looked at everything, with the complete, patient attention of a man who had already decided that whatever happened next, he would not be the one caught unprepared. "Lord Vane called this session," Sebastian said. "Lord Vane will open it." Cedric unfolded his hands and placed them flat on the table. His voice, when he began, was the voice of a man who had been presenting arguments to powerful people for decades. Measured, authoritative, carrying the particular warmth of someone who wanted to be believed. He spoke about the fire, about the guard rotation, about the absent men and the questions their absence raised. He produced documents, 2 folded pages that he passed to the counselor on his left with the unhurried confidence of someone who had written them himself and therefore knew exactly what they contained. He spoke about negligence, about the domestic staff, about the culture of carelessness that had, in his considered view, been allowed to develop in the keep's lower household. He did not say her name, not yet. He was building to it, laying the stones of the path one by one, and she could feel the shape of where it was going, the way you could feel the shape of a room in the dark. The 2 documents made their way around the table. When they reached the counselor nearest to her, a broad man named Lord Farron, whose territory bordered the eastern keep, she watched his eyes move across the page and saw the slight tightening around them that meant the document was doing its intended work. Her name would be on it. Probably a forged transfer request, moving a guard away from the east corridor. Probably dated 3 days before the fire to give it the texture of premeditation. She breathed slowly and looked at Sebastian. He had not moved. He was watching Cedric with that still, complete attention, one hand resting loosely on the arm of his chair, and he looked. This was the thing she had not expected. Entirely unsurprised. Not performing calm, actually calm. As though every word Cedric had spoken had arrived exactly where he had predicted it would arrive. When the documents completed their circuit of the table, Sebastian looked at them without touching them. Then he looked at Cedric. "Are you finished?" he said. Cedric's composed expression remained intact. "The council should be permitted to respond to the evidence presented." "Are you finished?" Sebastian said again, in precisely the same tone. A silence. "Yes," Cedric said. Sebastian reached into the interior of his tunic and produced a document of his own, not folded but rolled, sealed with the full pack seal, the wax unbroken. He placed it on the table and looked at Lord Farron. "Open it," he said. Farron broke the seal and unrolled it. His expression shifted through several registers in quick succession. Confusion, then comprehension, then something that looked like the specific discomfort of a man who has realized he is sitting next to a fire that is about to change direction. "Read the relevant passage aloud," Sebastian said. Farron cleared his throat. He read, "A record of communication between Lord Cedric Vane's private courier and a man identified as Brennan Morn, younger brother of the Northern Delegate Lord Aldrich Morn, currently serving as a trade envoy in the Eastern Territorial Office. The communication detailed a proposed arrangement. The arrangement involved the Eastern Reaches border records. It involved the suppression of a specific succession document. And it involved, the chamber had gone very quiet by this point, a coordinated timeline, with a notation that read, 'The domestic arrangement proceeds as planned on the night of the new moon.' The night of the new moon had been 2 nights ago, the night Eli's room had burned. Cedric's composed expression did not break. She had to give him that. 22 years of practice had given him a face that could absorb a great deal without visibly fracturing. But something left his eyes. The quality of certainty. The particular light of a man who believes the room is still controllable. "This document," he began, "was intercepted by my personal courier 4 days ago," Sebastian said, "before the fire. I have been waiting for you to present your version of events so that the council could observe the full shape of the construction." He looked around the table. "Every man in this room has now seen both documents. You are capable of drawing your own conclusions." "The maid," Cedric tried again. "The maid," Sebastian said, and his voice shifted slightly on the word. Not louder, not harder, but with a quality that stopped the room completely, ran into a burning room and carried my son out while her shoulder was on fire. She then came to me with information that she understood, correctly, could get her killed. She is the reason we are having this conversation at a council table, rather than at a funeral. He looked at Cedric with those pale eyes that gave nothing and took everything. "Her name will not appear in this proceeding except as a witness." The silence in the chamber was the kind that had weight. Lord Farron set the document down. The councillor beside him leaned back in his chair in the way of a man creating distance from something that had become dangerous to be adjacent to. One by one, around the table, the territorial lords performed their own small recalibrations, the minute adjustments of powerful men who had just watched the ground shift and were quietly ensuring they were standing on the right side of the new landscape. Cedric Vane sat very still. "You built this over years," Sebastian said to him, quietly. "Not for the room, for the man. My father trusted you, and you built this in the spaces his trust made available. You sat at this table for 2 decades, and you used everything it gave you." A pause. "And you pointed it at a 4-year-old child." Something finally moved across Cedric's face. Not remorse. Not fear, exactly. Something older and more exhausted. The expression of a man who had carried a plan for so long that its failure felt less like defeat and more like a particular kind of relief. He straightened slightly in his chair and looked at Sebastian with the direct, stripped quality of a man who had nothing left to manage. "The Eastern Reaches were promised," he said. "Your father gave his word." "My father gave a forged document under duress," Sebastian said. "That is not a promise. That is a crime that became your inheritance." He stood. "You are removed from this council. You will be held in the keep's lower ward pending a formal territorial hearing. Your assets in the eastern districts are frozen as of this morning." He looked at the guard at the door. "Take him." Cedric did not resist. He rose from the chair with the careful movements of an old man who had made peace with a particular ending, and he walked to the door with the guard at his elbow, and just before he passed through it, he stopped and looked back, not at Sebastian, but at Cora, which she had not expected. "You should have stayed in the corridor," he said, not cruelly, almost sadly, like a man acknowledging a variable he had failed to account for. "I know," she said. He left. The doors closed behind him. The chamber exhaled. In the weeks that followed, the full shape of the conspiracy dismantled itself piece by piece with the methodical inevitability of a structure whose foundation had been removed. Brennan Mourne was taken into custody at the Eastern Territorial Office and provided, under formal questioning, a complete account of the arrangement, the forged succession documents, the coordinated guard reassignments, the communication chain that led back through 3 intermediaries to Cedric Vane's private courier. Lord Aldrich Mourne, the Northern delegate, submitted a formal written declaration of ignorance of his brother's activities and tendered his resignation from the Territorial Council. Sebastian reviewed the declaration, found it credible, and accepted it. Bertram Hale was removed from his position as head steward. The network of favors he had maintained across the domestic staff was documented and dissolved. Several members of the guard rotation were formally reprimanded. 2 were discharged. Mrs. Aldrin, who had known nothing of the broader conspiracy, but had allowed Bertram's influence over the domestic roster to go unexamined for too long, submitted her own resignation with a letter that Cora, when she later read it, found quietly dignified. Dora was reinstated as Eli's full-time nursemaid with 2 assistants and a dedicated guard rotation that reported directly to the king's personal commander. She cried when she was told. Cora happened to be present and handed her a cloth and said nothing, because some things did not require language. The burn on Cora's shoulder healed slowly, the way burns did, not cleanly, not without cost, leaving behind a mark that would remain long after the pain had faded. Marin changed the dressing every morning for 3 weeks, and told her, with the matter-of-fact honesty of a healer who did not believe in softening things that were simply true, that there would always be a scar. "Good," Cora said, and meant it in a way she did not fully explain. She remained in the East Tower room. No one asked her to leave. No one reassigned her to the domestic roster. The gray wool tunic was joined by others, practical, well-made, chosen by someone with a sense of what she would actually wear rather than what would merely look appropriate. She noticed this. She did not comment on it. She was still learning what it meant to accept things that were offered without obligation attached. Sebastian came to the East Tower most evenings, not always for long. Sometimes he brought documents that required a second perspective, and she had learned in those early weeks that the second perspective he was seeking was less about the documents themselves and more about the habit of having someone in the room who said what they actually thought, rather than what they calculated he wanted to hear. She gave him that without effort, because she had never been very good at the alternative. Eli came too, most mornings before his lessons, dragging a wooden chair to the window and sitting in it with his feet dangling and talking about whatever occupied a 4-year-old mind with the full authority of matters that deserved serious consideration. Cora listened seriously. It seemed to be what was required, and she found, to her own mild surprise, that it was not difficult. One evening in late autumn, when the keep's inner courtyard was strewn with the first hard frost, and the candles in the East Tower room made the walls look warmer than they were, Sebastian stood at the window with a cup of warmed wine he had not drunk, and said, without particular preamble, "I would like you to stay." Cora was at the desk with a record she had been reviewing, the formal accounting of the Eastern Reaches situation, which she had been helping to organize because she had, as it turned out, a precise and retentive memory and a capacity for documentary logic that Sebastian had identified early and made use of without embarrassing either of them by explaining it too explicitly. She put down her pen. "As what?" she said. He turned from the window and looked at her. That complete, unhurried look that she had stopped finding unsettling somewhere in the past weeks, and started finding, she admitted privately, something else entirely. Something she did not yet have a name for, but that lived in the vicinity of the safest she had felt in a very long time. As whatever you choose to be, he said, the title can follow. It usually does. She looked at him for a long moment, this man who had crouched to her level in a burning-smelling corridor and noticed she hadn't slept, who had walked beside her through the keep as though rank were a concept for other occasions, who had said her name in a council chamber with a quality in his voice that had stopped the room, who had, she understood now, been watching her, not with the assessing eye of a man cataloging usefulness, but with the patient attention of someone who had recognized something and was waiting to see if she would recognize it too. She was not afraid of it. That was the thing she had not expected. After everything, the fire, the conspiracy, the careful architecture of people who had wanted her disposable and silent, she was not afraid of this. All right, she said. It was not a grand declaration. It was not a surrender or a capitulation or the collapse of all her careful defenses. It was a choice, made clearly, by a woman who had learned the difference between the two, and who understood finally that the things worth keeping were not the things that asked nothing of you, but the things that saw you completely and stayed anyway. Outside the window, the frost lay white, and even across the courtyard stone. Inside, the candles burned steadily in their holders, centered and safe, placed exactly where they belonged. Eli, when told the following morning in the simple and direct terms that a child deserved, looked at his father, and then at Cora, and then said, with the gravity of someone delivering a considered verdict, "Good, she has the right boots for it." Sebastian looked at Cora. Cora looked at Sebastian, and for the first time since the night a room caught fire, and the world she had carefully maintained burned with it, she laughed, fully, without restraint, without calculating whether it was appropriate or safe or too much. It rose out of her like something that had been waiting a long time for permission, and it filled the East Tower room until the walls seemed warmer than the candles alone could account for. The scar on her shoulder would remain. The memory of the fire would remain. The knowledge of what people were capable of, when power and patience and grievance combined into something monstrous, that would remain too. But she was here. She had chosen to be here. And the ground beneath her feet, for the first time, felt entirely like her own.